Hey Ananda, how you doing?
How are you, Harold?
I'm doing great. How's your con so far? What have you done that's interesting?
Well, let's see. I came to Saverio Spagnoli's historical presentation on Vijayanagara, which was very interesting. Um, and I listened to the first two-thirds or so of Ed Beach's Border Reavers presentation. I'd seen some much earlier prototypes of Border Reavers in Maryland when it was still, traveling was still happening, and it's nice to see where it's come. And to hear about how he landed on, you know, that topic after his sort of epic, his epic European historical games. Although, of course, it's easy to forget Ed is, also a very prolific Civil War game designer.
Right,
But yeah,
right. Not to mention Civ 5 and 6. Yeah,
yeah, on the digital frontier as well.
right.
Um, he let's see. I didn't have a chance to come yesterday because to anything at the con yesterday because of my day job flared up a bit, such as what happens when you work on a live game
Yes.
that
Yeah.
gets that we live balance every other week.
Well, Ananda, that's one of the things I wanted to chat with you about was talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about your work at Riot and what it's like to design a game in that environment versus board games, which we spend a lot of time talking about.
Yeah, so I've been little bit of background there. I've been working at Riot since 2015. In fact, a week from today is my 6-year Riot anniversary, as we call it there. It's my fourth studio job in the video game industry. And game design is different at every studio, but it is incredibly it is definitely, and it is Riot is no exception. At Riot, the approach to game design is so it's so tailored to League of Legends, especially within the League of Legends organization. Right, League of Legends has been out since 2009. It's been very successful. We have 100 million players across the world. And the game I work on, Teamfight Tactics, which launched just under 2 years ago, which is which is less about the sort of multiplayer arena fight and it's more of a tactical experience. Teamfight Tactics, we're doing great. We have 13 million players, so we have a lot. We have a lot of players to speak to, and players, they expect a lot from us, right? And so we, in order to keep the game fresh and to keep the game moving forward and balanced, it takes an enormous amount of collaborative game design, which Riot is I think we hire and structure very much towards. My team at Riot. So my title at Riot is senior game design manager. That was, I jumped onto the management track. Before that, it was principal game designer. And so right now, I'm, the design director of Teamfight Tactics is on vacation this week. So also this week, I'm the design director of Teamfight Tactics. and so, this week at least, I've led a team of 12 designers, and a bunch of engineers, a bunch of artists. And we have been working on. So I don't know. Teamfight Tactics is a game where you build a team of champions from League of Legends. You play, and then you face off against other people's teams in sort of real-time resolution. But unlike, but you don't actually control the fight. You just set up the armies, and then the games. Once the combat starts, you're sitting back and watching. And this makes the game a lot more accessible for people who don't have, aren't interested like me in very Twitch mechanics.
Not a dexterity test. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and this is something that I think this kind of relates back to board games a little bit and how innovation works. Or rather how we discover new genres or new subgenres of games, right? So a long time ago, in the late 90s, real-time strategy games were created in digital. There was Dune 2, there was Warcraft Orcs versus Humans, and so forth. Those were the early ones, right? You could even argue that the Ancient Art of War by Broderbund, in '86, I want to say, is the first real-time strategy game. I certainly make that argument when I'm at conventions, because that's what the sort of thing you argue about at conventions.
Right.
And so those games are about, you build a base and you use the base to, you collect resources, build a base, use the base to build soldiers of varying types in typically some kind of either soft or hard countering way against the opposing armies. So they're building squishy mages, so I'm going to build squishy assassins who can jump in and one-shot the mages. But if the assassins have to fight anything tough, then they're dead. And so, there's always these trade-offs. Age of Empires is another title that people are very familiar with, where it's like, oh, they have cavalry, well, I'll build pikes. Oh, they're now building pikes, I better build swordsmen, and so on and so forth. And so, real-time strategy games demanded a lot of the player, right? Like, you have to be constantly looking all over the map. You are controlling multiple units. When your army is fighting someone else, each unit is under your direct control, right? And you're also managing the economy. This led to a very steep skill curve for real-time strategy games. And real-time strategy games were very popular, but they kind of started to go into decline because they couldn't quite crack this audience problem, right? And then someone, as it turned out, a real-time strategy game player, thought, hey, what if I took everything that what if I took a real-time strategy game? In fact, he did so literally, and took Warcraft 3, which was moddable, and he made a Warcraft 3 mod called Defense of the Ancients, where it's like, this is just like Warcraft 3, except you only have to control one unit. How would that be? Wouldn't that be cool, right? And so he figured out one axis on which to make the game more accessible. And then that became the multiplayer online battle arena genre, of which League of Legends is a member, and which is now hundreds of times larger in terms of audience than real-time strategy games. And so 2 years ago, when a group of us designers within Riot, a couple of senior folks were pitching, we saw the auto chess phenomenon, which was the genre that eventually Teamfight Tactics would come to dominate. Part of the pitch that we created was multiplayer battle arenas were created by somebody looking at real-time strategy games and saying, what if I changed this one thing, right? What if you only had to control one unit instead of lots, and thus make the map focus problem easier, the control and micromanagement problem easier. What if we did something else? What if we said you still control all the units, but not all the time? Right, so we're going to have a planning phase and we're going to have a battle phase, and you are going to and you only control the army during the planning phase. What happens then? The answer, as it turns out, is another new genre, right? The auto battle genre, right? And I'm not going to pretend we were first to come to this. There were some older games that took a stab at this, but when auto chess came out, it was clear, at least to us at Riot, that it's like, okay, this is a big opportunity. This is a potential new genre. This is also a genre that we have the potential to create the leader in. So we're going to do that. And I think board games. I think so. With board games, sometimes you see dramatically innovative games, right? Like I'm thinking of Atlantic Chase recently, right? Which I think counts as a dramatically innovative game.
Sure, agreed.
Right, where Jerry White lays out his thesis about. I'm going to make a game that is about a conflict that was entirely about hidden information and fog of war, and there will be no actual hidden information in the game. Right? There will be no player screens. There will be no GM. There will be no counters that you stack on top of other counters to hide what's under there that only one side can examine. There will be no blocks that face one way or the other. It's all out there, right? It's all right in front of you. Yet the game is full of fog of war. That's what Jerry tried to do. And so I think I'm very grateful that there are dramatically innovative games, but I also think an important way of looking at games is, what are the things that are stopping people from getting into this, right? And what is one thing we can change that will then break that barrier, right? And will that create either a new genre or a new subgenre? that's kind of.
So does that theory also assume that you get some momentum from what was already hot, right? But slowed down. And if you're looking to modify in that regard, you're really capturing momentum in that innovation.
I don't think you have to assume that. I think I think that like real-time strategy games were good on their own merits, right? And it might very well have been that if you know if multiplayer battle arena games were kind of invented 5 years earlier, they'd have been just as successful just 5 years earlier, because the fundamentals of the game fantasy are so solid. So I do think it will certainly be easier to persuade your executives to do it if But that's why so many of these come out of mods, right? So many of these come out of the player community, and then we keep an eye on those things, and we try various things to get our own version of them.
So in effect, you look for what's hot from the mods.
That's, given how successful mods have been, that's, I think, you're stupid not to.
Yeah, agreed.
Right.
Agreed.
Like PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, the first battle royale game, was a mod.
Yeah.
And that picked up tens of millions of players, and then didn't scale well, and so others, and Epic saw the opportunity and made and pivoted Fortnite to be that instead of what it was. Right. I interviewed for a position at Epic when Fortnite was still a team zombie battler, right, where you and your friends build a little town and defend it against waves of zombies. That was what Fortnite was. And then a year later, they had completely redirected over to the battle royale mode.
Right. Yeah, and since you're talking about Fortnite, what is this relationship with with Apple? How does that impact the industry? And do you even see that?
I have not been following that very closely. I know a number of my colleagues have. I think I better keep my mouth shut about this.
Fair enough. Fair enough. No, it's my job to bring up the most controversial question possible without delving deep into your personal life.
Well, yeah. Let's just say we care a lot about that case. We care a lot about that case.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's important, and consumers care a lot about the case as well.
This is one of the things where the more senior you get in an organization, the more the cagier you have to get a little bit about what you say. I've gotten to a point where I can't hold forth quite as much about other companies.
Fair enough. I'm a little distressed to see the cagey Ananda Gupta, but I guess that's what we have to accept at this point.
On that subject, maybe.
Yeah. What about, so you mentioned Atlantic Chase. What else do you feel like has been innovative? And I think about, of course, Washington's War, well, We the People, Paths of Glory, your game, of course, Twilight Struggle. Did those make the mark for innovative, or do you think of it in a different way?
So I think we've seen a lot of innovation in board games, obviously. Spurred by competition, spurred by the accessibility of tools, spurred by opening the gates, spurred by things like the Zenobia Award, right? I think we've seen a lot of innovation driven by these things. As I spent like the first 10 minutes here talking, I don't think a game has to be dramatically innovative for us to praise it as innovative, right? Like Jerry did something very, very new. And it's, I think in the designer notes, he talks about how the idea for Atlantic Chase was born in 2001. So he's been working on it for a long time too. The risk of innovating like that is that somebody's going to beat you to it. I was worried about that with Imperial Struggle. But I think it's. I don't think designers have different attitudes towards innovation, and one of my goals in board game design is always going to be innovative and surprising and delightful to the player, right? Like there are some designer, and there's nothing wrong with the opposite view, right? There's nothing wrong with, hey, look, I'm not bringing, if somebody says, look, I'm going to design the best bulge game there is, right? There may have been 100 bulge games before, but my view of the bulge is different, or my view of the bulge is unique. And, I'm going to use pretty conventional mechanics, but I'm going to make a different point about the bulge. Or I'm going to make it, I'm going to emphasize differently, or frankly, somebody like, so innovation can even be heavily driven just on the visual side, right? I mean, Rick Barber, rest in peace, right? He, Summer Storm with, showing Gettysburg, depicting Gettysburg as only he could, right? Mm-hmm. And his other games, where the innovation came on the transportation side, right? On being transported to another place, and the designer, to the designer's vision of that. I think, I think that's, just topic choice can be innovative, but to me personally, those things will never be enough, right? It is not enough, right? It is not enough to have, as a designer, I'll play those games all day, right? But as a designer, if I'm going to produce something, it's got to have like really innovative systems and mechanics. And I think we got there with Imperial Struggle, at least in the sense of trying to grapple with a huge design challenge, 100 years and 4 wars, right. without being World in Flames.
No, measuring competition in world and peace, or in war and peace, is, I think, an interesting take and different.
Yeah. So I think, I think the way, the different types of innovation that designers bring to their projects is all highly personal, but for my own part, like I'm, Imperial Struggle, the dice kind of withered away, right? Like the early versions of Imperial Struggle had dice, and then there was just a lot less rolling, and then there was a lot less rolling and less rolling, and then we didn't need dice anymore. And yeah, I mean, obviously diceless is not super innovative, right? Sekigahara, right?
Yes.
And many others, right? But I think, yeah. So it's not like that, but it's more about what are the systems that bring that era to life in a way that captures the emotional, political state of the player you're trying to transport the actual players into, right? I think, and this is to me very refreshing about board games and working on board games, and why I continue to do it, even though I spend my days working on a giant video game. It's that players really like things they understand, and players, there's a lot of expectations that players build up as they engage with a game, and so innovation becomes kind of a downside at a certain point, right? Like because players who have invested months or years in your game, that knowledge is valuable, right? They don't want it invalidated, and they're right not to want it invalidated, right? They don't want, if they spend 5 years mastering your game, and then you're like, oh, hey, I'm going to change the game so that all that mastery that you built up is only half as valued, is only half as valuable at being competitive at the game, or right. Or at playing the game well by whatever standard you have. They'll be annoyed, and they're not wrong to be annoyed. And so this actually kind of affects how Jason and I approach Twilight Struggle, right? Like there are sometimes interpretations or readings of rules where we think, oh yeah, that's actually might be kind of cleaner than what we've ruled in the past, right? But we won't adopt it, right? Because to do so would be to invalidate the knowledge of players who have already internalized the things that we've told them, right? And that cost of change is something that that any designer has to keep in mind once the game is out.
So, you were talking about innovation isn't always attractive. I think about, I'm going to interview Ed Beach at 3 o'clock, and he's the proprietor. Well, I don't know what you would call it, right? He's kind of he has watch over the great battles of the American Civil War. Not great battles, great campaigns of the American Civil War.
Yep.
And that particular design has a lot of archaic feel to it, right? I mean, I think if we started that series today and we presented it that way, we would be not that excited. But there's such a large following, right? To your point, that he can't innovate.
Yep.
As a caretaker, he can't innovate.
Right. What the players want is novelty without innovation, which is not; those are not the same thing, right? I think, obviously, an innovation will take hold if it's sufficiently compelling. An innovation might take hold regardless of sort of existing player sentiment. But boy, it's an uphill climb, right? And so, So novelty without innovation looks like we're gonna port this system over to a new campaign, right? We're gonna port this system over to well, that's pretty much it, actually, right? Yes. Like that's kind of what novelty without innovation in that context looks like, right? And I think Coin has a whiff of this, right? To be honest, I'm not saying Coin titles haven't been innovative, because clearly they have, right? With Gandhi, having the nonviolent protest stuff going on, and then like there's the solo features that have been coming out, but I think part of the appeal, like if you had a Coin game where you had an action called Rally, but it just worked completely differently from every other Coin game that had an action called Rally, players would be like, come on, what are we doing here? Right. And maybe that's kind of a cheap example, right? But I think if you had a Coin game, well, I'm not sure.
It's certainly the case now that we're at number 10, right, or 11 or 12.
Yeah.
But Andy and Abyss clearly was innovative, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Right. It built on Labyrinth, and so like has clear ancestors, but that doesn't mean it's not innovative. And Abyss was incredibly innovative, right? And I think, I don't know what the engagement patterns look like, but it wouldn't surprise me if the topic of Andy and Abyss kind of made it fly under the radar for a while. Again, it was a while ago, right? It was 2000. When did it come out? 2005 now? No, later than that.
Yeah, it's been.
Let's find out. Andy and Abyss.
10 years.
Andy and Abyss came out in 2012. Okay, so yeah. Right. So I think, it took it. I think people who played it saw the compellingness of the system, or at least of the promise of the system, right? And the promise of topic breadth that it brought. But it wouldn't surprise me if there was some adoption, some adoption friction there.
Right. It's funny. It also drives those innovations also drive, the first games in those series, even Twilight Struggle, drives some interesting discord in the wargamer community, right?
It does. I mean, right, there's the classic, is it a wargame or not? That's that's that always comes up. I'm not fully sure what a wargame is, so I take no position, but I think the fact that people care enough to argue about that is very gratifying, certainly. And I think right. That's just definitional stuff, and Jason gets very cranky about that, right? Like Jason you know, Jason tried to coin, Jason tried, I think somewhat successfully, to coin that Atlanticist label, right? The idea of a game that's halfway between a Euro game and an Ameritrash or or an American style game, whether that's like a more beer and pretzels-y game like Fortress America, or a more hardcore game.
Right.
But there's an interesting question in the chat, which is before and during the design process. So Michael Head asks, before and during the design process for Imperial Struggle, were you ever conscious of, or did you and Jason ever have any discussions about the pressures of trying to design a successful follow-up to such a successful product the Twilight Struggle game? The answer is yes. So Jason and I didn't talk about it that much, but at least, so speaking only for myself, I felt enormous pressure. It took, or rather, I should say, it took enormous emotional energy for me to continually persuade myself that Twilight Struggle is not the bar, right? Twilight Struggle can't be the bar, because so much went right for Twilight Struggle that it would just be unreasonable. Like if I waited until I was completely sure that Imperial Struggle was better than Twilight Struggle, then it never would have come out, right? It just never would have. What ended up being enough for me was when some playtesters came back saying, I kind of like this one better, right? That ended up being enough.
Right.
And I'm not saying we wouldn't have shipped it if no one had said that, right? But the fact that some people looked at it and, like, for whatever reason, lack of dice, topic, greater, even greater scope and sweep, right? The War and Peace stuff. I think, it was very reassuring to hear that, okay, yeah, it feels like this is a step forward, right? You've done something new here that is an evolution, right? Will everyone think the resulting evolution was strictly better? No, that's okay. So I think, but yes, it's like the fear of being, the fear of not living up to Twilight Struggle's legacy was definitely a factor. And it was an enormous, it was definitely a barrier, like some friction to me.
At the same time, you left a lot of Twilight Struggle behind, right?
Yeah. That's where that innovation point comes in, right? Like I was not interested in doing a game that was a close sibling to Twilight Struggle in mechanics. I do think that Imperial Struggle is a close sibling to Twilight Struggle thematically, right? Like it is another epic struggle between two great powers of the world who have very ambitious goals for the world, right? Like that theme unites the two, and that's why they're both called Struggle, right? And so to Michael's second question, have we seen the last of the Struggle series of games? I don't know. Maybe. I think that my next game will definitely be smaller it'll have a smaller sweep, but I would like it to be epic in some way, right? Even if it's not like a global map, right? Even if it's not powers with the type of reach that allows them to just reach out across the globe, right? Like that, maybe it's not that, but I would like it to be about something really important in the same way, and an important contest between two very opposed antagonists, right? Or to one another, right? Very, very opposed causes. And if that may be enough for it to be called Struggle.
Do you mind talking about what you're working on?
Not at all. Yeah. So there are a couple of things. There are a few potential follow-up bits to Imperial Struggle that are kind of kicking around between me and Jason. One of the advantages of Imperial Struggle's small event deck is that if we want to add some, it can be kind of slotted in there more easily. And so, unlike Twilight Struggle, where the deck shuffle timing matters a lot, it just matters a lot less in Imperial Struggle. So we can add more historical events to the game as players have become more familiar with the game, and thus not defeat our goal of creating a game that players don't have to learn a huge deck of cards to be great at. And then Another thing that I've been interested in. So one of the systems that we cut from Imperial Struggle that might come back as sort of a bonus expansion is war tiles that care more about board position, right, or have special abilities, right? So like all the +3 war tiles in testing had special abilities. So Marlborough would be, Marlborough's like base. He's base value 2, but becomes +5 if certain conditions are met. So he can be very, very important on the battlefield. Makes him more Marlborough, But I think, the problem with that was it was just kind of too much rules complexity, and it led to kind of a bad play experience. And so thinking of a slicker and better way to do that without, whenever you draw a special tile, you're like, oh boy, let me look up what this does. And thus A, signal to your opponent that you've drawn a special tile, and B, add more, add more unexpected complexity, on a tile pull. I think, so that, coming up with something like that. And then frankly, there's also the possibility of new investment tiles, right? Like we could have wackier investment tiles that have, either, maybe some of them have multiple minor actions. Maybe some of them have a single type of action, right? So it's like, this is economic points that you must spend in India, but it's a major action worth 6, right? Or there's one type of investment tile that we've kicked around a little bit, or at least that I've come up with, is an investment tile that allows instant removal of conflict markers, right? So there's just a bunch of different options on investment tiles that I want to deal with. The problem is playtesting bandwidth, right? Like playtesting takes time and attention, and so it's just always kind of time consuming to stand up another playtesting effort. So I think we'll see how that goes, though. We'll see how that goes.
Good.
And then on the new game front, there's I'm working on a game about the French Revolution, which spoiler for again from Michael's question, was, would it be a struggle game? The answer is I don't know yet, but I do think it qualifies as the type of epic conflict between utterly different visions of the world, and mattered a lot, right? Mattered a lot. It's interesting because it's kind of fashionable to say, well, the French Revolution started with a king and ended with an emperor, right? And they didn't actually become a republic again for until 1846, and so what was it all for, right? Like, did it really matter much in the end, right? And the answer is the French Revolution mattered an enormous amount, right? There are laws and customs and procedures in France that date from the revolutionary era, from the First Republic today, right? Just like there are in the United States, and there's so much there's so much to be said. Like the sheer number of reforms made at every level local, right? Local, state, and federal, basically, right? The number and variety and breadth of reforms that were made in the French Revolution, it's jaw-dropping. How many changes were made and how many new laws were passed and how many elements of French law and policy were updated, and it's just right. It's easy to lose track of that when it's like, yeah, but they still ended up with an emperor, right? And yeah, of course, that's true, but that's really eliding the impact that happened, and so and moreover, just like on the civil, and this happened on the civil side, right? This happened on the civil side, and it happened very fast. These changes happened in 2 or 3 or 4 years, and they generated a momentum, an avalanche, right? Because people saw how fast things could change, and that impelled them to move even faster. And so when you look at when you look at a society that wants reform, and like the French, for 100 years, the French Revolution was the model of, boy, this is what you have to do if you want to get things to happen fast, right? And it also happened on the military side, right? It took the First Republic, what, 4 years to achieve the territorial gains that the Valois kings had been chasing for centuries, right? Like if you interviewed all of the Valois kings and said, hey, what's your wish list? What are your foreign policy ambitions? What do you want? And took that list. Pretty much the First Republic got all of that within 4 years, right? They just swept the table, right? And and so like that kind of pace, that dynamic pace of change, is just an enormously interesting and it's an enormously interesting and inspiring and kind of terrifying view, right? or prospect, right? Because well, of course we also know what happened with the French Revolution, with the bloodshed and the illiberalism that occurred. There's an old game. Anyway, yeah. So like that's why I think it might get the struggle tag. I don't know. I have no idea what the title's going to be, but it might be. It might get the struggle tag. And I do think that if the game fails, the game will not ship unless the Republican player has that feeling, has that feeling of cascade, right? Has that feeling of I have virtually unlimited potential, and the only thing that is stopping me from remaking this society is myself, right? Is fear, right? That's the only thing, right? And the anti-Republican player, and spoiler, it's going to be a 2-player game, and the two sides are the Republican and the anti-Republican player. The anti-Republican player is like, this should be unthinkable for that player, right? Like the unthinkability of what is happening should be where that player is emotionally, right? Like, and so yeah, there's just a bunch of mechanics and a bunch of there's a like in some ways I think it has to be kind of like the anti-coin, right? Like coin games, they're characterized by the incrementalism of what you do. And then you have very specific, in Fire in the Lake, you have pivotal events, and Liberty or Death, you have the campaign cards, I think they're called,
Brilliant Strokes.
Brilliant Strokes, yeah. And so yeah, Brilliant Strokes that let you kind of rarely at special moments violate that incrementalism. But like new players often voice frustration, at least in my experience when teaching coin games, new players often voice a little bit of frustration of like, we've been playing for an hour and the board doesn't seem to have changed that much, right? Like the board doesn't seem to, like, there's more pieces and pieces have been removed and stuff, and like these tracks have moved, but it doesn't feel like a lot has happened. And then you have to kind of point out, well, actually those things matter a lot, right? The things that you're pointing out that seem like little changes are actually very important. And I think this game has to be the opposite of that, right? This game has to be like the board and the state and the player's frame of mind is just whatever happened last year feels like 100 years ago, right? It could have been 100 years because that's the pace of change we're at.
Right. So I don't want to argue with you about the impact of the French Revolution, because it clearly was tremendous on France and the world, and certainly put kings around Europe, on notice, right? But is it also interesting that we're multiple constitutions into the country of France, right? The U.S. same constitution generally for 200 plus years, but in France that hasn't taken the same traction.
Yeah, I mean, a cynic. So of course, a cynic would argue the U.S. doesn't actually have the same constitution, right? Supreme Court precedent and decisions have de facto amended the Constitution. That's what some people would argue.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I'm sympathetic to that view. Sometimes I'm not. Whereas, but yeah, like, I mean, the French had three constitutions during the revolutionary period, right?
Right.
And I think, uh, you know, it's easy to think, well, yeah, this is just a very different, like, they just had different outcomes. Well, I don't know. I guess what I would say is, when you look at the reasons why the French Constitution, like the first Constitution, the one that was drafted, where they formally created two classes of citizen, right? There's a and they have like the concept of civil rights and political rights, right? And everyone has civil rights, right? So everyone has the core civil rights, but only if you meet certain conditions do you have political rights. And specifically the right to vote, right? But there were other political rights that you did not have unless you were a member of this other class. And the Jacobins, and I use that term in the broad sense at the beginning of the revolution, right? So the generally large Republican faction was like, we cannot, like, it doesn't matter what else this Constitution does, right? It doesn't matter that the king becomes, the king is much reduced. It doesn't matter that that there's the franchise. It doesn't matter that we have this structure, or that we have this layered structure of representation. No, it doesn't even matter if women can vote, right? Like, all of that is great, but we cannot sign off on a constitution that creates two classes of citizen. That is not acceptable. And that was just, and so, like, that was just something that the Republican faction was just unwilling to compromise on. And when you look at the American situation, where we were able to compromise on a constitution despite having slavery, right? And having a bunch of the states saying we shouldn't have slavery, and a bunch of the states saying we must have slavery. It's easy to say, well, yeah, the Americans got it done and the French didn't. But I think the differences in regionalism and the different regional elements at work in the two countries, the sheer sizes involved, I think those all were factors into why the very first constitution. Oh, and frankly, the king, right? The fact that the French had a king who had a lot of expectations, and a lot of supporters who had a lot of expectations about what that person's role would be, right? Whereas America had just fought a war to not have a king. Right. And so with there's one of the passages, one of the books I read for while researching this game, and I'm not nearly done with the book reading part for this, but Jeremy Popkins, A New World Begins, he quotes another historian who says, if Louis had had a little more vision and a little more vision and a lot less susceptibility, right? He could have emerged from the French Revolution not only alive and not only still king, but with his powers increased, right? Not because he would have remained an absolute ruler, he definitely would not have, but because the country that he was leading would have been so much stronger, right? So much stronger, and wealthier, right? Like, wealthier and stronger and more dynamic, right? Like, he would have emerged as the head of state of that country. And so even if he doesn't get to do literally whatever he wants, which of course he found out he doesn't get to do anyway, he would have come out, he would have been, he probably would have preferred that outcome. Let's just put it that way.
Yes. And painless. Yeah.
And so I think, the fact that the fact that France already had a king and a nobility and a tax structure that had centuries worth of privilege and tradition and frankly nonsense built into it, those were all things that were going to hinder a constitutional process.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting, right? I mean, one of the arguments for why the U.S. Constitution is resilient, if you accept the word resilient, there is that there were 13 colonies that didn't like each other, right? I mean, they fought together, but they hated each other. You didn't travel colony to colony. You made fun of everybody around you, all the colonies around you, and so, the fact that that you had such a diverse group, and not diverse in the European colonial term, but diverse because they were different. They did different things. They liked different things. They had different priorities. And so from that comes a constitution that, measures things a lot of different ways, and
right.
and maybe survived. I don't know. It's an interesting question, but despite the fact that there were, royals and not royals in France, there's certainly, a little bit more homogeneity, I think, right?
Yeah, there was. I think that's true. I think that's true. And yet, one could also argue that France had a tradition of liberty that, while very distinct from the Anglo-American and later like purely American conception of it, was in some ways deeper rooted. And so I'm remembering, so France, of course, had slavery, was a participant in slavery just like the other European countries. But unlike other European countries, France did not have slavery on its home soil. It had slavery only outside of its home soil. And this was because in I think the 14th century, Louis the 7th, 8th, I forget his regnal number, but Louis made a royal proclamation, which was any slave who sets foot in France is thereby freed. Mm-hmm. And there was there was an anecdote I read about where a slave ship, racked by storms, pulled into, I want to say Nantes Harbor, and the captain ordered the slaves off the ship onto the pier so that the ship could be kind of drained and repaired. And so they do, and then the people of the town go, okay, great. So do any of you where do you guys want to stay? Can I offer you a meal? Like, do you have any money? Basically trying to do deals with them. And the crew is like, what are you doing? These are slaves. And they're like, yeah, they're not anymore. Right. And the captain's like, what do you mean? This cargo's worth blah, blah, blah. And the town's like, yeah, tough. Right. Yeah. You freed them all when you let them off the ship. Right. And now, right. and so the captain ordered the crew to, of course, take the slaves back by force. And the townspeople responded with force, and because that tradition was 400 years old,
right?
Right. and right, it's like that's not how it works in France. There's no such thing there's literally no such thing as a slave in France, right. But there is such thing as a slave outside of France in a French territory or colony. And actually, as a follow-up to this story. Reading about the Revolutionary era specifically really does cure one of the sort of respect for Napoleon that one might have, even outside of his political activity. Even outside of his wrecking, of his betraying the Republic and turning it into a monarchy. Leaving that aside, the fact that the First Republic abolished slavery and Napoleon reinstated slavery in the colonies, right? Like that by itself. Is a it's hard to imagine a greater enemy of liberty than someone who undoes abolition of slavery.
No doubt. And to bring that around full circle to some of the other themes in the con, in the Zenobia Award, I have a mentee that is doing the Haitian Revolution, which is slave revolt, right? And just such an interesting game and topic looking forward to that, and looking forward to this one. So I appreciate that. Are there any good games on the French Revolution? I mean, Wallace has one, but it's a puzzle more than it's a
Yeah, right. It's
study.
more of an abstract. It's more of an abstract kind of area control election game. That's right.
Yes.
I think the one that I'm especially inspired by is an old game by As Your Wish Editions. Have we talked about this before?
I don't think so.
Called La Révolution Française. I think it came out in the early mid '90s. It was one of the very first games I ever played over email, with after college, and the game was created by a group of French academics. They were all first-time game designers, and they were French academics, and it is exactly what you would expect if you had 4 French academics designing a game about the French Revolution with no game design experience. It's the game is a glorious, ambitious, unplayable mess, and it's a 6-player game. Has 6. They call them currents, right? They refuse even to call them factions, because to them the word faction implies a greater level of cohesion than existed at this time in this context. And I remember I played as the Maréchards, who are a sort of moderate faction, and the game is full of great ideas, right? It's got this really novel victory system. It's got a really novel victory system. It has systems for a lot of different things, as you might expect. It has systems for a lot of different things that nonetheless kind of, they really bring out the character of the era. But ultimately the game is very hard to play. It's a game of constantly looking up tables and forgetting modifiers and so on and so forth. And so I think, when I looked at this, and this kind of gets back to the innovation point, like, what are some of the barriers to entry I can reduce here, right? And getting it down to 2 players is an interesting idea, right? Like, how do I get this down to 2 players? How do we get this to be a system where you don't have to read about the capabilities of every possible government type to know what you should be voting for? The game also had other degenerate problems, like the Feuillante faction, which starts out as the most powerful faction in the legislative regime, right? So during the basically the era of that very first constitution, the one that the Jacobins rejected, the Feuillantes start out in a great position, and their job is to basically make sure nothing changes, right? They want the game to end in the legislative era. They want, that represents the survival of that represents the survival of that constitution, and probably the transition of France into a constitutional monarchy. That's really hard, obviously, when you have 5 other players who are not super interested in that. But also, like, if what happens historically and the Feuillantes kind of get purged out around turn 2 or turn 3, the Feuillante player is kind of, well, what do I do for the rest of this game, right? Like, the Feuillante player is kind of done. He's just done, and that's why another reason I went down to 2 players, because 2 players in this context means that the Feuillante faction can start out as a Republican faction, right? Or as sort of a soft Republican faction. And then the Republican player and the anti-Republican player's actions will determine what happens to them. And maybe some of the Feuillantes will go over to the Royalists, who are definitely anti-Republican, right? Maybe some of them will stick with the will stick with the Republican side. Maybe they'll just kind of dissolve and die out. There's just a bunch of things that can happen, but it doesn't matter. Like, you don't have a player who is stuck playing, half the game in a situation he can't possibly win. And so yes, so that game, like that game, is a fascinating game to me and a source of great inspiration. But it's also very much like here's what I don't want to do. It's also a cautionary tale. So I think, and that's, you know, I'm not super familiar with other French Revolution games. Obviously, there are games about Napoleon's early campaigns and so forth, but there are not other French Revolution games that I have been deeply engaged with. Interested if the audience has any has any titles I should play.
Right. Now let us know. We'll get them to Ananda and get them up to speed. You've got to figure that there's some floating around Europe that are just aren't on our radar, right?
Yeah. We're increasingly starting to see, for example, screenshots of different games from Japan and China. You know, like Japanese and Chinese historical games.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, some of those look really interesting, and I want to play them.
Yes.
I'm super. I'd love to some of the Chinese games in particular.
Mm-hmm.
You know, about the Warring Kingdoms period, about the Tang Dynasty. I would love to see. So like there was a Britannia style game called China the Middle Kingdom that Decision put out a while ago, which I found it was very long, like Britannia games. It was, you know, but it was what it said on the tin, right? Like this is Britannia in China, right? I do think that historically it had some issues and it was perhaps too ambitious, but boy, I would love to see like another treatment of that. You know, Britannia, I don't know. So Michael Hetton in the chat also asked, you know, what types of games do I most enjoy playing, digital or tabletop? I mean, I play a huge variety of games, but one of the things that I like to do is play games and see how they could potentially be updated or improved or otherwise or stolen from, you know. I think and you know, I have the new Britannia, the one that was just the Kickstarter, and it has a 2-player version. I'm looking forward to playing that, because I think if somebody can figure out that sweep of history thing, but in a modern sense that doesn't require quite so much dice throwing and quite so many windows of action, right? Like, oh, I attack, okay, I roll my dice, you roll your dice, great, okay, are you leaving? No, okay, I'm not leaving, great. So already we've had, you know, three passes of the stick, right? And then, okay, let's roll dice again. Okay, this is what happened. Are you leaving? No. Am I leaving? You know.
Well, you know, it's funny you mentioned playing games on email.
Yeah.
When you play games on email, you really start to appreciate that passing the stick, don't you?
Yeah, and games that minimize it. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not gonna lie. There were certain design decisions that made an Imperial struggle that were made to minimize the passing of the stick. Right. When I was working on Legends of Runeterra, which is Riot's digital card game, we would often lament that there's no digital equivalent of the nod. Right.
Yes.
So like if you're playing Magic the Gathering and it's turn 1 and you play a land, you know, and then you nod at your opponent, and that's all they need to know to realize you're done, right?
Yeah.
Right. And there's, you know, in a digital game you have to push a button or click something, and
right.
And that actually is a UX challenge in capturing. If you want to have a very interleaved back and forth system, then or set of mechanics, then that's important, right? This is one of the reasons why, for example, Hearthstone, which is a very popular digital card game from Blizzard, this is why Hearthstone is very much I set up my board, I do things, and then I just kind of. But I never have any decisions to make during my opponent's turn. Mm-hmm. Right. I never make decisions during my opponent's turn. Right. Hearthstone is basically a game of alternating puzzle setups. Mm-hmm. And, you know, when we made it Legends of Runeterra, we wanted to introduce the concept into a digital card game of I make decisions during my opponent's turn in certain cases. And that turned out to be really hard from a UX point of view.
Yeah. Yeah, just Squad Leader or Combat Commander would be such great games online, and could reach so many people, but you can't do it because the opportunity fire just makes it impossible.
Right. Do you want to up fire in this hex?
Yeah.
Okay, how about now? Okay, how about now? Okay, how about now?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Give me an affirmation. Yes or no. Yes
Yeah.
or no. Yes or no.
Yeah, we experiment with a lot of different solutions in that space in Legends of Runeterra, and yeah, it's hard. It's real hard to it's hard to deliver that.
Yeah, not certainly not without changing the game dramatically.
Yeah,
which is possible, right? I mean, that if that's the alternative, I would be okay with it. But Ananda, great to talk to you, man. Thanks for taking the time, and thanks for coming to the convention. And you're active. I think you've got a game coming up here against our very own Edgar.
yeah, 3 o'clock Imperial Struggle.
Yeah. Well, he's anxious, so be kind.
Well, I think Edgar and I talked about this. I think we're going to make it it's going to be more of a chat game. Like we're not going to be going for the jugular in this game.
Right. No, that's good. And I'm joking. He's going to love it. You guys will have a blast. So thanks again for coming and taking the time to talk.
Thanks for having me, Harold, as always.